Welcome everyone to our lectures on the Exalted Treatise on the Response of the Tao. Just share this PowerPoint. Today we will be focusing on these particular sentences. As a reminder, we are looking at the very long list of misdeeds. So these ones are to mistreat orphans and coerce widows, as well as to ignore the law and take bribes. So when we read about this particular line, the first one, mistreating orphans and coercing widows, makes us think back to an earlier sentence in the Exalted Treatise. I don't know if anyone remembers, but earlier when we were reading about good deeds, Kelly spoke about taking pity on orphans and being sympathetic to widows. Now, the question is, do you think that the Exalted Treatise is repeating itself? Sort of saying the same thing. And certainly when we read the commentary, it does note the fact that perhaps this repetition is important because this is something that's that needs to be stressed. However, at the same time, it actually isn't a repetition. Why? Because look at the first line here, the misdeed. To mistreat orphans and coerce widows. Now, clearly, that's a wrongdoing. But if we didn't do that, that doesn't necessarily mean that we will actively take pity and be sympathetic to them. In fact, we could just ignore them or neglect them. But as long as we don't mistreat them or coerce them, then we are not performing this misdeed, doing wrong, as we would say. So you can see here very clearly that the misdeeds, the list of misdeeds, is really just minimum standards, things that we shouldn't do, but we should in fact be very proactive in doing more. So in other words, it's not enough to just say that I'm not mistreating orphans and I'm not coercing these vulnerable people, but actually I really should be proactive in providing them with assistance. So in fact, the two sentences are quite different. The attitudes are different, but also the first one is just a wrongdoing. The second one is being proactive and actually helping. So there's a story that's listed in the collected commentary, and it's about a particular man this is during the times of Imperial China, and he's living next to a very wealthy family. So his neighbors are quite wealthy. But unfortunately, due to some disease, perhaps it's contagious, many of the members of that family pass away in a short period of time. And the only surviving members of the family are that of a grandmother and quite a young grandson and her grandson. So really only two members of the family have survived this disease. So this man, this neighbor, he thinks about taking advantage of the situation. So he invites the widow and this young grandson over on the pretense of, being very sympathetic of their plight, wanting to assist and help out. And in this kind of atmosphere, when they think that he's quite sincere, he makes a proposal to them and says, look, the way that you're going to go on just living off your property is not going to be enough, really. Why don't you sell your property to me and I'll take care of it, I'll manage it, and, I'll make sure that you are well looked after. And certainly, it sounds quite dubious to us, but really we have to remember that in the society at that time, women were in charge of looking after the household, looking after the children, the family, whereas it was male members of society who had to sort of look after the property, manage the property, and earn the money, so look after the income. So in a way, this widow and her young grandson really needed some help on that front, and they felt that their neighbour was quite sincere in offering his assistance at this time, and so they very willingly, signed away the deeds to their property, and in fact, their entire property was in the hands of their neighbour. Well, as you expect, that as we said, he wasn't very sincere, and what happened was that in a short period of time, he actually evicted this widow and her young grandson. So essentially, they were left homeless, and they couldn't do anything about it because the deeds of the property were in his hands. The following year, what happens is he has this dream, and in which one of the members of the family that passed away, accuse him and say that misfortune will befall his family. And sure enough, what happens is that the following year, there are thieves that raid the property, raid his house for valuables, and in the ensuing sort of chaos and disorder, there's a lot of violence, and in fact, his whole family is murdered, including the man himself. So what happens is that what the grandmother, grandson hear about this, and they return, and essentially their entire property is returned to them. So quite clearly you can see that this man was really just taking advantage of the vulnerability of the widow and the grandson, that family. Not only was he not grieving with them, not only was he not sympathetic during this very difficult time, but he was trying to take advantage. And very quickly you can see the consequences of that. It was only a few years before very drastic consequences occurred. It seems dramatic, but actually, these stories that are selected for the commentary really sort of help us to understand this principle of causality, to help us understand that the importance of each of these sentences. So, not only should we be sympathizing, assisting vulnerable people in society, in fact, not just widows and orphans, but in fact anyone who loses their loved ones, who loses, family members. But if we don't do that, if we do the opposite, if we mistreat them, we take advantage, exploit them in this vulnerable time, then the demerits and the resulting misfortune are multiplied. And we can see that in this particular story. It's very well highlighted. It's like stealing from a charitable organization. We should be giving to that charity, but the person in fact takes from that charity, steals from them, then actually doubly wrong. So what do we do when we learn, when we think about these sentences? Well, if we are in a position of authority in which we are able to immediately within our organization look out and help these people, then that's great. But for many of us, we're not in that position, and it's just a matter of being aware of this. And when we encounter someone who has lost a loved one, to realize that this is an opportunity for us to help, to in our very busy work lives and family lives, to make particular efforts to help at this time for them, to provide, even to just offer assistance, and be sincere in that offer for these people. And I guess, in such times, it's important to really make sure that we sympathize. Maybe something like this has happened to us in the past, or maybe not, but all of us are part of a family, and all of us at some point in time will lose loved ones. And so it's a matter of, putting ourselves in their shoes. A friend in need is a friend indeed, helping at that very crucial period of time, and then realizing that actually we're just paying it forward. That when we require assistance, then we will also achieve. We will also gain assistance when we are in a vulnerable position as well. So these lines, they seem quite simple, but when you look at the one's motivations, why we would consider doing this, why we should in fact be sympathetic, it sort of makes you think about how we interact with people, and how we can make the most of our interactions, and when life presents us with opportunities to assist, then we seize those opportunities and help out. So in terms of this idea of orphans and widows, because we have covered this, I'll refer you back to the past lectures and I won't go on. We can move on to the next sentence, which is the idea of ignoring the law and taking bribes. And in fact, this sentence, as well as the ones following it in the Exalted Treatise, the next sentences are to treat the right as wrong and treating the wrong as right, to administer excessive punishment, aggravate executions with rage. All of these lines, you can see there's a common denominator here, and it is that it relates to people who are in positions of power. Okay, so the first thing that we think about when we think about, the idea of ignoring the law, taking bribes, of course, is those in politics, and those in the judiciary, so in the system of courts of justice. In say, for example, in Australia and the UK, the legislative aspect and the judiciary aspect are separated. But in the past, in Imperial China, those who were officials also had judicial responsibilities, and in the sense that they also they had responsibilities in deciding cases, civil cases, criminal cases, etc. So we need to keep this in mind. But I think that beyond, let's say, the judiciary or the those with legislative authority, in fact, we can think about this particular line, ignoring the law, as ignoring regulations. And then this really opens it up to anyone in a position of power, any sort of professional. And obviously, we know that in some countries, things like taking bribes, this culture of bribes, of corruption is quite endemic. You hear of stories in some countries of police officers pulling over, making up, fabricating sort of traffic offences and pulling over drivers, and just to take bribes. You even hear of medical professionals. Sometimes there's a long wait list, and if the family offers a gift, expensive gift, then maybe they can jump that queue. You hear of teachers, in a very competitive educational environment where marks, passing assessments, grades are really important to get into good universities, that some teachers may take gifts in order to, and with the implicit assumption that they will pass those particular students or give them high grades. So, just listing a few kinds of professions, but I'm sure that you yourself may think of others that might also be affected in this kind of this in which one's professional ethics may be compromised. So ignoring the law is not just the law as in judicial aspects of the law, but also any kind of regulation. So there's a strict sort of code of conduct, strict regulations, but these are disregarded when these professionals take bribes, they accept gifts. And unfortunately, in some places, as I mentioned, these societies are such that the culture is such that it is like that. And it's almost accepted that people with wealth and power are beyond the law, that they can do whatever they want and get away with it. But, I guess for many of us, those sort of societal issues are things that we may not be able to make an impact on at this stage in our lives. But what can we do? And I think that for most of us, the question is to think twice about accepting gifts when we are in a professional role. Okay, so what do I mean by gifts? I'm not talking about gifts that you give as a birthday present between friends, or gifts that you give when you come back from a holiday. We're talking about gifts in terms of your professional role, from clients, from patients, from customers, etc. And these gifts can come in many forms, as it says, you see here. Something that they made at home, some food, free tickets, but also, depending on your role, can be quite expensive and lavish gifts, like a car or things like this. So they come in many forms. Now the question is that what is a gift? Well, ultimately, it is something that some extra benefit that you receive that is beyond the appropriate and contracted, so agreed kind of reimbursement that for your services. For these services, there's a certain expense or fee, and these gifts, might be monetary or otherwise, are beyond that. Okay? And it means that not everyone has to give this gift, and the gifts can come in many forms. Now, gifts can be a genuine expression of gratitude. But at the same time, what we need to be careful about is when they are an attempt to manipulate and create a conflict of interest to cloud your professional judgment. So here are some questions that Johnson and Ridley offer in their Handbook of Professional Ethics, in the sense, so questions to ask ourselves. The first is, why this gift at this time and in this context? Okay, so yes, there's a gift, but what kind of gift is it? We've already talked about the different forms. But what does this specific gift achieve? And the timing of it. Now, it's very different if, say, for example, and this often happened in the hospital I was working at. The patient has been discharged. The family are very happy for the care that they've received from the nurses, the medical staff, and give a box of chocolates as a gift, expression of gratitude, to thank the staff. Now that's very different from if someone's on a wait list, they're lying in hospital waiting, and then a very expensive gift is given to the attending doctor. So can you see that the timing has to be considered as well? It's quite logical to think about it. And then what does the gift symbolize? Is sometimes from a cultural perspective, a gift that might be seemingly innocent or seemingly quite inexpensive actually symbolizes much more for the person giving it. It could be, a religious symbol or something. And that needs to also be taken into consideration. What kind of gift and what does it mean, not for yourself, but for the other person? And what are the motivations of the person giving you the gift? Are they trying to curry favor, please you in some way, manipulate your decision making? There are many motivations, and it's important to keep in mind the not just what the gift is, but what is its intention. And also that, yes, it might seem quite innocent, quite inexpensive at this point in time, but actually over time, the person giving the gift, their perception of that gift giving, the gift itself, may change. And in this text, Johnson and Ridley write about how, when it comes to ethics committees and complaints to, say, ombudsmen and tribunals, what often happens is that a gift is given and then later the client or the customer then it feels that they have been exploited, that they felt in they were compelled to give a gift. And this was something that they sort of reflected on later in time. So after all of this has occurred, maybe at the time it was quite benign, good intentions on both sides, but then later they think, well, actually, why did I need to give that? Maybe I felt compelled in some way, and then, it comes to the attention of some tribunal. So that's often, it's also important to keep in mind. And then, okay, well, let's say between the two parties, yourself and the gift giver, both are quite happy with it, both think it's quite reasonable. But what about others? What about your colleagues? They may not see what the gift is, they just see that you've been handed a gift bag. And what might the family members of the client or other the colleagues of the client think that maybe this kind of person, you as a professional, are soliciting gifts, that you accept gifts as quite frequently, and they may question your professionalism. So where does that leave us? As it says here at the top, think twice. It's not to say that we can never accept gifts, because if it's something small, like, say, thank you card from a child, then it's fine to accept that. In fact, refusing it might seem like you're rejecting their friendship, that you are insulting them in some way in the family. But when we do accept gifts, think twice, that's all, and be very careful. Because what we don't want to find ourselves in this position in which we have a conflict of interest, our professional judgment is clouded, and how we and the gift itself that changes how we make decisions in relation to this particular group's organization or the client in the future. So that's what we need to keep in mind. This is the idea of giving gifts, of accepting gifts. And in the conclusion, Johnson and Ridley also talk about, at the end of the day, always think, is this in the best interests of my client? Okay, so always put yourself in their shoes. And the other thing is that if you think you deserve a gift, then you need to think again. That actually you're already being remunerated, you're already being reimbursed for your services, that it's all part of your job anyway. You shouldn't be thinking that you deserve extra. You shouldn't be thinking about that you deserve this gift. So they sort of alert professionals to this kind of mindset. So always think about the other person, the other party. What's in their best interests? and hopefully that will help you. So coming back to the principle in the Exalted Treatise, I think that with this particular point about not bending the law or regulations, and making sure that we think twice about accepting gifts, it actually relates to the Taoist canon in general. We know the Exalted Treatise is a Taoist text, which very much sort of has this underlying principle about this principle of causality. And I thought to share with you another line from the classic, the Tao Te Ching. Basically, unfortunately, I forgot to put in the English translation, but basically, if we were to literally translate this line, it means that the net of Mother Nature is very expensive. Okay, so that's the first 4 words. Now, that's a literal translation, but what does it actually mean? It means that the surveillance of this kind of sort of surveillance we talked about earlier in the Exalted Treatise, the idea of spirits sort of detecting and evaluating what we're doing, that's extensive in the sense that it extends across time and space. Okay, but the second part of this phrase is that it says that, yes, the so-called net, the meshes, are actually quite far apart. So meshes are far apart. What does that mean? It means that, okay, we don't feel its presence. We go about our daily lives. We're not thinking about spirits, or we're not thinking necessarily about the consequences of our actions all the time. But yet, nothing escapes. So everything is detected. Every misdeed, every wrongdoing, even if other people are not around, is recorded. And also, on a positive note, every good deed is also recorded. And with the resulting good fortune or misfortune, respectively. So in the sense that the Tao Te Ching, this classic of the Taoist canon, explains that we shouldn't think that people can get away with things. We see some people who might be powerful and wealthy and think, well, they seem to get away with it. There's no punishment. Or in our daily life, we do something against our conscience and think that we might be able to get away with it. But actually, when we read these texts, it just reminds us of the importance of being very careful what we think, say, and do, that there are consequences for everything. And if they are all detected, they're all recorded, and just a matter of time before we experience the consequences, before the consequences catch up to us, and nothing escapes. Now, this is not just, emphasized in the Taoist canon, but when we look at the Confucian canon, so the documents is one, part of the 5 Confucian classics. And there's this line. This line is also quoted by Mencius, and it says that calamities sent by nature, say hurricanes, earthquakes, etc., they can be avoided. If we look up the weather forecast, we can move with early, predictions, etc. But it says that the calamities caused by one's own actions, there's no escape. So this is quite important, so important that it's also, it's not only recorded in the documents, but also in the Mencius, that we need to realize, yes, there are natural disasters that can affect some people, but we as individuals can escape from that. We can avoid that. But what about the calamities or the consequences, the misfortune, things that happen to us are not because of some random, accident, but actually we create them. So because we've, through our thoughts, words, or deeds, created the cause, well, it's a matter of time before we feel the effects, and there's no escape. So this is something that the Confucians also talk about, and obviously, for any of us who've read Buddhist texts, we also know that Buddhism talks about not only the consequences in this lifetime, but consequences, so-called karma, for future lifetimes. And so you see that the three sort of main traditions of Chinese philosophy are very much, and there's this consensus of this principle of causality. And certainly in other faiths, we have the idea of what we reap, what we sow. So having said that, I want to sort of share with you some stories that are seen in the collected commentaries. And just stop the sharing for a second. So basically, there are a few stories, quite a number of stories actually, from the collected commentaries, and I've selected a few. The first is about the head of a prefecture. And it's a short story, but basically what happened during his short time as an official, as the head, was that he would often solicit bribes and not only that, but also appropriate public funds. And all of this property, what he appropriated, he loaded onto a small boat, thinking that he would, he had retired and he was about to travel back to his hometown. But what happened was that before he could do that, the boat actually caught on fire, and everything that he had sort of, put in such hard efforts to appropriate, and in using these unscrupulous means to do so, everything was lost. So you can see that if it's not really meant to be yours, then you will not be able to enjoy that good fortune. And in fact, whilst accumulating this so-called fortune, this wealth, he probably accumulated a number of demerits and, in the future, misfortune. So that's, from the perspective of, just not being able to enjoy the wealth achieved through unscrupulous, unethical means. But also, there are further consequences. So there were two officials. They lived in different times in Chinese history, and they were well known for being quite cruel, for being manipulative, exploiting others, and it was such that if the common people didn't bribe them, they didn't give gifts, etc., then these people there were at risk of being punished quite severely and quite violently. So they were known for being quite violent and cruel during their time as officials. And what happened to both these people, and why sort of their stories are sort of in the same sort of told together, is because for both of these officials, their children were born with very poor health and, in fact, didn't survive beyond infancy. It was observed that these children, the state of their limbs was such that it was almost like they'd been born with shackles, with chains around their arms, their hands, their wrists and feet. And then shortly thereafter, they passed away as well. And this happened to both of these officials who were not related in time and place. So you can see that the misfortune is not only for themselves, but also extends to their family. Both of these officials were later sentenced to very severe and cruel punishment, and ultimately death. So actually, for both officials, and just two cases in the collected commentaries, it tells us that the consequences are quite severe. You're using and abusing your power to manipulate and exploit the powerless, the common people. And not only that, but even many people, if they're growing up in this kind of culture in which corruption is quite endemic, you might not think too much about it, but actually even isolated instances can be quite can have a severe impact on one's own destiny. So the third story that I want to share with you is about a man called Chen Gongcai. And he was quite young, when he had a dream that foretold that he would pass all of his examinations. So in the past, the examination system was such that you had exams, provincial level, district level, metropolitan, and then ultimately the imperial palace. So there were a series of levels of exams. And, many people had to study for years. Some people didn't pass in their 50s. They may have to try several times, up to, even 10 times for one level of the exam. So the fact that he was foretold that he would pass all of the exams in his first go was something of great fortune, good fortune. What happens is that, as predicted, he passes the first level of exams, the provincial level. It's the district level. He also passes that, no problems. But then when he gets to the metropolitan level of exams, he fails. And then he starts to doubt the accuracy of this prediction. In those days, when people had these very clear dreams, when in this dream it was said that someone had told him that this would occur, they put a lot of faith in this. And then he sort of started to doubt whether that dream was quite accurate or not. And shortly after, he had another dream. And in this dream, the person tells him that actually he was meant to pass, but his fate changed. Now, so the person uses a good analogy. He says, well, it's just as if the emperor really favors a minister. And because he favors this minister, sort of trusts that he has the potential to do a good job, then sort of promotes him to a senior position, gives him a good salary, etc. But what happens is that this particular minister abuses his power, doesn't fulfill his responsibilities, his duties. Then what's going to happen? Well, that minister will shortly be demoted, if not dismissed. And so the person in the dream tells him, well, this is the same, that originally you were meant to have this very good fortune of passing all the exams and also achieving a very senior position in the government. But what happened? Well, in your time as a minor official, so by passing the provincial and district level exams, he already was employed as a minor official, whilst at the same time studying for the high level exams. This often happened to scholars in the past. So as a minor official, and we said that minor officials, they had to look after not only government, but also judicial aspects. So they would determine civil cases as well. So said that because of that, you actually accepted bribes on 5 accounts. Okay, so this was all recorded, it was listed. And because of these instances, just these 5 instances, then your destiny, your fate has changed. Not only will you not be able to pass that exam, you will not be able to achieve that official position, of course, but your lifespan has also been shortened. So, in fact, you can see that just by, these isolated instances, many people, maybe the scholar, thought that there was nothing, that everyone was doing it. Everyone around him, his colleagues, were also accepting bribes, etc. Well, in fact, it still counted. And it still had an impact and a consequence on his fate, on his destiny. So he changed his destiny for the worse. And, he wakes up from this dream. In those days, of course, as a scholar, you would have read these texts, the Confucian classics, the Taoist classics as well. And you would understand that everything that occurs, everything that happens, is the result of our own actions. And so what he did was, through his shame and remorse, he changed, turned over a new leaf, and did not, completely, in his roles and his jobs, was considered a person of integrity. And yet he passed the exams, but he never achieved the high official position that he had originally been destined. So you can see that this kind of, these misdeeds, they have an effect on our property, our career advancements, our destiny, and ultimately even our lifespan. And based on the stories of the two officials before, it also has an impact on our family. So it's not something to be taken lightly. And whilst these stories are about officials and politicians, you might say, I think that we can think about it from professional perspective, from the idea of professional ethics. So I want to talk about the next line. Share this with you again. And you can see now how it's all related. To treat the right as wrong and to treat the wrong as right. And this is, again, in relation to someone who's in power. And essentially, the collected commentaries explain that this occurs for three reasons. The first reason that someone might bend the law or break the rules is because of their own self-interest. Okay, so we said before, this idea of accepting a bribe and therefore your professional judgment being clouded. So you're only thinking about your own interest. The second is perhaps you have some sort of relationship with the other party and your emotions get in the way. So again, this is this is considered a conflict of interest. And the third reason is because of negligence. So not being clear about the regulations, not being clear about the law, the codes of conduct, and just going along with the crowd or not fulfilling your responsibilities. Now, when I think about this, I think about my experience, in terms of when we interview others for jobs, right? And when you interview others for jobs, there's a clear sort of selection criteria. What the person has filled out an application form, answered questions, they've got their CV, they come for the interview, and then at the end of the day, it's a matter of sitting down and objectively looking at, well, what does the job require, and do the applicants have do they have what it takes? Do they have the potential? Maybe they don't have the experience, but do they have the potential to to do well in the role, based on what they've said and what they've provided. And you can see, of course, that if any of those decisions are affected, any of the decision-making process is affected by any one of the people having some sort of self-interest or being emotionally involved with any of the applicants, then, or even sort of just being negligent and saying, okay, well, it doesn't really matter about the selection criteria or what the job descriptor, but I'll just go with my gut instincts, then you're going to make the wrong decision. And what will happen is that right and wrong, what should be appropriate or what is inappropriate, is then confused. And there's another story of here. There's the story of an official, and you can see how it relates to the previous one about bribes. So this story is about a man, and for some reason, he suddenly dies. So his name is Fan Guang, and his son, and also his dog, are struck by lightning, and it's fatal. The only surviving member of the family is his wife. And in those days, people had this idea of this principle of causality. And so they asked the wife, what happened? What was he doing in the days before or recently, such that he experienced such misfortune? And the wife was quite honest. She says that recently he had decided a case. This magistrate had decided a case in which two parties were sentenced to imprisonment. One of the parties was actually guilty, and the other one was innocent. And the guilty party actually bribed Fan Guang and ultimately was pardoned. So you can see that the right is wrong and the wrong is right here. It becomes confused when you have your self-interests. So the guilty party was pardoned. What happened? The innocent party, the other person, was severely beaten as part of the punishment and forced to admit to guilt. Therefore, the other person can be pardoned. Now, not only was he forced into an admission of guilt through the punishment, but also his food was taken away, and this food Fan Guang gave to his son and the dog. And it was said that when the man, because the man was starving to death, basically, in the days preceding his death, he was seen to be sort of looking up to the skies, to the heavens, and making accusations. And then a few days later, this happened to Fan Guang. So, the stories in the collected commentaries are quite dramatic because they're really there to help us understand that what's a split-second decision, these decisions that you make in which the rules are bent or broken because of your own your own professional your professional conflict of interest. There are far-reaching consequences. So his son, we said, was not involved in the process, but actually also suffered the consequences. So ultimately, when we look at these lines, as I said before with the previous line on orphans and widows, they really just provide us with minimum standards. If we are law-abiding, if we don't accept bribes or gifts, if we're able to, accord with standards and regulations, actually, that's not really doing a good deed. It's just not doing wrong. Our jobs as professionals in any role is to do more than that, is to really fulfill our responsibilities, go over and above our service. And I guess it makes me think of what Confucius once said. This line is in the Highest Learning, one of the 4 books of Confucian learning, but it's also recorded in the Analects. And Confucius, having been a magistrate himself, says that when he hears these cases, actually he's much the same as other magistrates, in the sense that, he listens carefully to both sides, to both parties, plaintiff, the defendant, and sort of tries to come to an objective, reasoned sentence or judgment. And I guess, but what he says is, what's different about him? He says, well, hearing lawsuits, I'm the same as others. What's different is that I try to make it so that there are no lawsuits. In the sense that he felt that his job, his role, was not just about hearing out both sides and coming to some decision that was objective, but actually his role was to provide that example of honesty, integrity, incorruptibility, provide a moral exemplar, as well as teach others what was the right thing to do. So much so that those who were insincere, who were out to frame others, out to use their wealth and power to litigate against others more vulnerable, that these people would be ashamed and would not even come to the courts of law in the first place. So you can see here in the last lines, not permitting those whose claims have no substance to exhaust their explanations, and to instill this respect in the people, a respect for morality, a respect for virtue, so much so that they realize that's more important than litigating. So you can see that Confucius took his role as being more than just listening to cases, but went over and above that. And that's what I guess the Exalted Treatise, by reading these lines, hopefully, and through our explanations, you can see that it's not just about, okay, well, I'm not going to do that and probably will never do that. I'm not in a position to accept bribes or break the law. But actually, in our everyday jobs, in our roles, it's not just about complying with the regulations, it's about doing much more. And I always like to use the analogy of health. So what is health? The definition of health is not an absence of disease. The definition of health is that you have this physical, mental, and even spiritual, moral well-being, that you can contribute to others and have meaningful relationships. But that takes work. That means that you have to be proactive. You have to be, actively create this well-being. It doesn't just come because you have, normal blood test, clear chest X-ray. So similarly, your professional ethics, being professional, is not just about complying with the standards of your particular job, complying with the job description, but actually going above that, thinking about, okay, well, what kind of example am I setting in the greater scheme of things, not only with my colleagues, in some cases clients or customers, but also within the community, and how can I be the change that I want to be. So, as I said earlier, there are some societies in which problems are quite endemic. We may not be able to make immediate changes, but we do what's within our own power. We do what we can do on an everyday basis, and the decisions we make on an everyday basis in our lives actually has far-reaching consequences, not only for our own moral, physical, mental well-being, but also the people around us, our family, and then ultimately, as we aspire to the ideals of Confucianism in the sense that he's thinking about, well, how can I create and affect change in the community at large, and hoping that others also value this virtue. So stop there today and leave you with that. There are obviously other lines that we have not had the chance to look at, and we will cover that next week. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you very much.